Hello and welcome to KingstonCitizens.org's Roundtable. What's the process? Our programs are recorded and broadcast every week where we tackle local City of Kingston and Ulster County topics with a range of guests with our co-hosts. My name's Rebecca Martin and I am a co-founder and the director of KingstonCitizens.org, and I'm joined with my other co-hosts.
I'm Lynn Eckerd, and I'm a professor of politics at Mayor's College and a former alderwoman and former Ulster County legislator, which is really hard to say all of that in one sentence.
I'm Jennifer Schwartz Berky. I'm an urban planner and planning consultant, as well as a former legislator for Ulster County and a longtime friend and advisor to KingstonCitizens.org.
And to learn more about Kingston Citizens, you can visit our website at www.kingstoncitizens.org. Next week, we're going to be diving into an issue with Dan Shapley from Riverkeeper, who's the director of the water quality program called Pharmaceuticals and Other Unregulated Contaminants in the Hudson and Rondout Creek, that kind of came about through this Columbia University study with Riverkeeper that we posted recently, because in it identified high levels of pharmaceutical drugs in our overflow in the Rondout Creek. Outfall is what it's known as, and that's pretty interesting. So we're going to have Dan come on and talk about that and other emerging contaminants and the nuance of this problem. So we're looking forward to that. But tonight, we have a special guest. We have Council President Andrea Shaut, and I'm going to bring her in before we go any further. Get her situated. Here she comes.
You know, Rebecca, this just came to my mind. We might just take a moment to recognize the political context around us. It's been a terrible couple of days. And
let's do that. Let's get Andrea in, and that's a good idea.
Okay.
Yeah. Andrea, are you here?
I am.
Oh, here she comes. Hi, Andrea.
Hi.
Andrea.
All right, so
Look at that flag.
It's for our council meetings. I have it back there for our pledge, and I just haven't removed it yet. But I figured it was appropriate. So
yeah, so tonight we are very happy to have Council President Andrea Shaut, and we're going to shortly get into a topic title, walking through the local law process in the City of Kingston, which is something we hope to do more of, to talk about procedure to help the community understand how it works, even maybe some of the council members. It's really interesting to go through and to identify the timing and the process of local laws, in this case for tonight. Andrea, I have a little bio piece for you, and I wanted to read it, that you're not only a prominent musician in the Hudson Valley, and you've graduated from Ithaca College with a music performance degree, and are well known for your collaborative solo piano work. You've been the musical director of the prestigious West Point Military Academy Glee Club since 2010, or?
yeah, the pianist and rehearsal assistant.
Okay, that's pretty great.
You just gave me a little promotion, but thank you.
You're welcome. Hey, listen, I'm good like that. And you are from this area, born and raised, with all sorts of interesting family connections to local community politics, as well as local music, and your family's esteemed program, jazz program at the Kingston High School, a grandfather, I think, who used to be the town supervisor in the town of Ulster.
Yep.
And a few years ago, you threw your hat in the ring and ran for council, or alderperson, alderwoman, and succeeded, took out the incumbent, which is not easy to do in Ward 9. And you served for 2 years before launching your run for council president and succeeding and becoming the first woman as council president, but really in high executive office. I mean, it's not executive branch office, but high office in the city of Kingston. So thank you for your service. Welcome to our show. Maybe you can say a few things about that, and maybe we can also launch in for a few minutes about, Lynn had mentioned, talking about the moment of time that we're in, and lead us into a little bit of a conversation about that, and we can get into the wonkiness of local laws in a little bit.
Yeah, I'm happy to be on the show, and I'm just also proud to be, a Kingston or right outside Kingston native. Thank you for highlighting some of my family, because I'm very proud of the work that they've brought to this city and different things, mostly in music, but some nurses here and even some politicians. And I actually just came from the Walk for Black Lives that Kingston is having. I didn't get to march all of it with them. I think they're still going. So I'm here with you guys instead. But it was pretty powerful. There were well over 1,000 people there. So it was pretty awesome to be a part of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just, it seemed to me that it was important to note that it's been a really trying time, and that we've seen, this unbelievable violence. It continues against Black Americans. And, we've had situations here in our own city, and to finally be able to say, enough. And I think it's important to recognize the rage, the heartbreak, and the need to really do something tangible. And I think it's fantastic that you went out and you walked and were part of the protest. It's an important show of support.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, Lynn. Jenny, do you want to add anything to that?
Wow.
I know.
Well, I think maybe on another show, we could start to ask questions about power structures, and a time to really examine how we're going to start making changes to that. I have to say, I'm very proud that in the last election, we were able to raise the consciousness of the county and elect a different kind of sheriff, for example. And I think that these changes only come about if we can really mobilize and get people out to the polls, but also to be active between every election. And I think that's part of the work that we're doing here. And I think there's a lot more of it that needs to be done. And so I'm just grateful for everyone who shows up to volunteer in some way. That's the only way that we're going to make the change.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming out late, Andrea. I know you're working hard, wearing many hats. It seems to be the way today. And we thought it might be interesting tonight, as we're thinking about, a process in the city as part of the legislative branch of government, right? You're a lawmaker. You're part of a team of lawmakers. I know you're not a voting member, unless there's a tie, but you are helping to lead or to support your council body to understand the processes that they have to follow when something comes up, and having to understand those processes, I'm sure, is always a big learning curve as anybody comes into office. So we thought we'd start there. And, Jenny and Lynn, I'd love for you maybe to speak to what the local law process is, its history, where we've done some work to outline that, and we can lead into two matters. One, especially if we have time to do this, it would be good. We know that there's a local law number 3, that's moving through, or maybe it moved through already, the council this week. And it would be great to get an update on that and that process. And we also have fleshed out other local law processes that we've been a part of, that show even some process flaws that are interesting to analyze, and put them into a context that's a local context. So if that sounds good to everybody, maybe Jenny or Lynn, we can start to just talk about the state law and how it works for local communities and for the county as well.
Lynn, would you like to start, since you were on the Themes of Laws and Rules Committee?
Yeah, as far as, and I'm not, Andrea, you can help me brush up on this because you're probably much more familiar with this, but, and I'll just sort of give the general guidelines. But effectively, if you're changing a local law or you're putting into place a policy that is categorized as a local law, it has to go through this longer process. It's not just simply produce the policy, vote on it, and get a majority vote. The proposal has to go through laws and rules. It has to be voted out and scheduled on for a floor vote. And before you can vote on the full floor vote, there has to be, I think, a 2-week period of time in which it's read on the floor at least twice. And then I can't remember if it's the second or third time that it's read. I think it's the second time that it's read. And Andrea, you can correct me if I'm wrong, you get to vote on it. But it has to be read and there has to be a period of public comment. Then if the council votes in favor of it, it's got to go to the mayor. And then the mayor has to hold a public hearing before the mayor can sign it into law. Am I on the right track there, Andrea?
Yeah, it's mostly right. I mean, it goes through laws and rules. It goes to the council floor for our first reading, and then the next month, it goes for the second reading with the vote. And then the mayor has 10 days to hold a public hearing, and then he votes after the public hearing.
Let's start from the very beginning, though, because when we say laws and rules, there might be people who don't understand what that is. So when a piece of legislation comes to the council as a local law, that's been identified. The local law process is identified prior to it coming to the Laws and Rules Committee, which is one of the Common Council's committees where they do their committee work, right? So how is the local law, how is it determined that it's a local law? And then who walks it? What's the first step of it being introduced to a Laws and Rules Committee? Where would that be submitted in order to be assigned? Like, let's start from the beginning. And then we'll stop. And then we'll take the next step of the process.
Yeah, talking about the Laws and Rules Committee. So the Common Council we currently have 4 standing committees, and Laws and Rules is one of them. And those are really where I say the magic happens, because that's where the work happens. That's where all the discussions take place. So if you really want to know what's going on with the council, you go to the committee meetings. The council meeting is more of the formal, go through. Sometimes there's more debate, but the debate and the discussion happens within the laws and rules.
Or caucus, right? Which we can get into. Caucus
too, yeah. So a law or any legislation is sent as a communication to the president of the council. And then once I have that, or whoever's president has that, then they assign it to one of the standing committees. So if I were to get a local law, then it would go to the Laws and Rules Committee because they discuss the laws. But I don't know if that's, Rebecca, what you were...
Right. And there's laws and rules, there's finance, there's public safety and general government, there's
community development.
So those are the 4 committees. So based on what is in front of you, you would assign it to a committee that would be relevant to be able to discuss those issues.
Correct.
So it's gone. So the local law is gone now. It's been assigned to Laws and Rules Committee. Does there have to be a sponsor of a local law? Like, how does that all work? Does there have to be someone on the Laws and Rules Committee to sponsor a law, or does that not come into play at that point in time?
A local law does have to have a sponsor from the legislative branch. So it cannot be presented to us from the executive branch and then it just passing. It does have to have a sponsorship from one of the council members.
Anybody have anything to say?
Yeah, I was just wondering, does it ever happen that there might be an agenda that's coming from outside of the legislative branch and it makes its way in as a proposal? So the sponsor effectively is bringing something that might be from an interest group, or how does that work?
I mean, it definitely has happened in my 2.5 years where I've seen it a couple of times. It happened earlier this year. It happened earlier in my first term where the executive branch came and presented us a local law without getting a legislative sponsor. I haven't seen in my tenure any special interest groups presenting a local law for passage, but it would be the same thing. You do need to have somebody from the legislative branch to sponsor it. But you could have the idea stemming from anybody. It's just once it actually goes to be considered, it does have to have somebody from the legislative branch.
Okay. And what is the what tends to be the impetus for someone sponsoring a law? So where not the ideas, but why would you, as a council person, for example, an alder person, want to bring a local law to the floor or through committee to the floor?
I actually haven't sponsored a local law in my tenure. You know, the one that we did pass a local law last night, and that was to amend another local law from, I believe, 2018. That was created, that we amended that because over time we realized that we wanted an addition to what the council did 2 years ago. So, you know, it's a live and learn situation. You pass a law and then you learn a little bit more about what can make that law better or stronger. So that's kind of where that one came up from.
And in that case, just because I don't want to lose our pathway through the process, but that local law 3, which would be interesting to touch upon in a little bit, had already.
I'm gonna just jump in because it's actually local law 1 of 2020. It was a typo, so I did yesterday.
Right.
So the flaws. Sometimes typos happen. So it is local law.
Thank you. Yeah, local 1 of 2020. The typo though is an easy fix, but if the legislation passes out, I mean, you can't just amend the language on the floor, can you? It would, and I'm getting ahead of myself. Exactly. It would have to, if there were any changes to the language, it would have to be sent back to committee. Isn't that right?
Yeah, if you change the language of the local law, you know, through debate and discussion, it then has to go back because you still have to have a 7-day waiting period where the council has it on their desk. So you can't just amend it on the floor because that takes away that the waiting period that's necessary.
What triggers a local law? I just wanted to, you know, while we're walking through at the early phase of it all, but you know, what would require what happens for the Corp Council or whoever to say, oh, this is a local law process?
I should have offered that background in the beginning, and It's essentially the idea of home rule, in which there are certain affairs of local government that the state law really can't touch. And according to our constitution, state constitution, those include property, affairs, or government, and that meaning local government, like the affairs of local government. So our the basic home idea of home rule in New York State means that there are certain things the state can mandate, and there's certain things the state cannot mandate, and that the municipality has the right to go beyond and pass its own local laws to address. So one example would be this one that has to do with the landlords registering, because that's about property. Another was, for example, the way that we structured the Historic Landmarks Preservation Commission. And as we might get to later, another had to do with the way that we organized our control over our water department, our water authority, and our own charter. So those were ones that, again, they are not in the purview of the state if, for instance, as a charter city, we have the control over our own water authority. So that's what triggers a local law, is the desire for a municipality to further define how it wants to handle those particular issues.
So Andrea, is it fair to say there are a couple of different kinds of laws that you guys would maybe deal with? Maybe one would be dealing with a charter, which calls for a different kind of process than a local law. Are there any other categories of law that you guys have to address, or is it pretty much either amending the charter or local law?
Well, actually, most of our work is through ordinances, the resolutions for the ordinances, which is, I mean, what is it, June 3rd today? And we are just passing local law number 1 of 2020. So most of our work is not through the local law process, which I think that makes it tricky, because if we don't do them that often, it's hard to understand the process. You know, and Rebecca, in her, or at least the intro that I heard when I got in here, you know, talks about it's a big learning curve for council members. You know, and she also mentioned I was a music performance major. So, you know, I don't have a law degree, so we rely heavily on either. What was that?
Yet. The law degree.
Law, yes. Don't tell everybody my secret there. We rely heavily on lawyers or doing our own research, you know, and that's one reason why I really want a lot of these processes to be very clear, because council members, when you serve for 2 years and you say the learning curve takes 4 months to learn, you know, that's a big chunk of your 2 years. So I'm glad that like this show is happening, and hopefully council members, current council members and maybe some future council members listen to it and learn a little bit, because we just don't do a lot of local laws.
So when you change a local ordinance, it's also through the Common Council, is it not?
It is, and it goes through a similar process where it is communicated, the communication is sent to the president. The president then assigns it to one of the 4 standing committees, depending on what it's addressing. It goes to committee, and then after the committee vote, it goes directly to the floor for a vote. So you don't have to have a public hearing, and you don't have to have 2 readings plus the vote. So It's a shorter process.
And for people who are not familiar with the difference between a law and an ordinance, does somebody want to tackle that one? Okay, so we have 3 levels, basically. There's the resolution, which is more or less about guiding procedure, operations. Would you say that's correct?
Let's not confuse everyone, though, and stick to our local law, because, you know, the only reason I hesitate is because I think you could do a program on each one of these things.
Okay.
But,
well, I just want to say there's 3 levels. There's the resolution, which is a little bit more at the sort of very local level. It doesn't rise to the level of a law that has to do with the police power, what is essentially this property affairs or government, that local law is. The ordinance is in between. It's like the code, like zoning. If you want to change an aspect of the zoning, like the signage, that's ordinance. And then there's law, which
Right.
is the strongest form of local sort of local autonomy.
And it's great thank you, Jenny, for the context too of the triggers for local law. I think that's helpful. And, just moving backwards to where we are in the process. So we talked about legislation being assigned or being sent to the council president, and that is you to assign it to a common council committee. And in the case of a law, it would be laws and rules, that it needs to be sponsored by a lawmaker, by a council member, and not by the executive branch and not by a community member. It's got to be a legislator that sponsors the legislation. There's debate around this local law process, and the public comment, we've invited them, I've heard tonight, to, if you want to know what's happening with the council, you go to committee meetings, but often there's no public comment period. There's no way to really engage. It's at the public comment period, or even being a guest is really up to the chair of that committee. They don't have to oblige, right? So in your opinion, you can go and listen. It's important. And we encourage the city to film everything. That's really helpful for those who can't attend these committee meetings on a regular basis, which would really be important. But is it really a good place for the community to engage in council work?
No, I guess it wouldn't really be engaging. It would be listening, which I also see importance in, but you're right. It's up to the chairperson to determine if there is even public speaking in that committee meeting. I think, right now, some of them do and some of them don't, but committee chairs change every year. So, there's no consistency in whether or not public can speak at these meetings. But ideally there is comment at the council meeting, but at that point, we're all voting on it that night. So to change a council member's mind, I've seen it happen through comment, but is a little trickier because at that point, the council has done their homework. We go into the meetings pretty much set to know how we're gonna vote. So public comment really needs to be reaching out to your alderman. Maybe even, this is a lot of work on the public and a lot of responsibility, but checking the monthly, what's going to happen at that meeting and go to the council meeting before the committee meeting, which again, that's a lot of responsibility on the public to do, but that's when you get to speak to the full council.
And it's challenging because you can see what the committee work will be in the communications segment of the Common Council agenda, but you might not really know to do that in terms of being able to follow
you don't have a lot of time. I mean,
right.
Communications come into me on a Friday afternoon, and depending on how quickly the clerk's office could get them up, it's either Friday afternoon or sometimes Monday, and the council meeting's on Tuesday. So it really doesn't give a lot of time for the public to do their research and to know, what we're really talking about. So it's definitely an imperfect system.
There's a gap in that part of
Yeah.
And that's good. We'll mark that. Moving forward in this, just because I know we have limited time, the council gets to the point where they want to vote on the local law. And what's interesting, I think a lot of people don't realize, is that you need to make a motion and have a second, and then you take a vote. And sometimes you have, the council members in committee, which is 5 members, I think. It's not the full body, which is 9 members.
Right.
May agree fully, may not, but it doesn't matter. Once there's a motion and a second, even if it fails to achieve consensus, it still leaves the committee to go to the floor, which is caucus. And in this case, caucus, there's one, there's not two, right? There's the Democratic caucus. Usually in the past, I've seen the Republican caucus. I think we have an independent member who just joins the Democratic caucus. So can you talk a little bit about that step that maybe is a little unknown, that it doesn't have to have the majority in order to move through committee?
Right. So when it goes to standing committee, it's really a recommendation of that committee. It's not a pass or fail kind of vote. So as long as you have the motion and a second, you could then vote. The vote could be 2-3, not recommending it. It goes to the council floor. Most of the time, the council votes with the recommendation. But I've seen it actually in a local law process where it passed through 5-0 in committee, and then on the council floor failed to get through. So, and you could have it both ways. So it really doesn't reflect what's going to happen. It's just what's typically you see. But there's still time to reach out to your council member and talk to them.
The same has happened frequently in the county legislature, at least while I was there. Things would get voted back to committee very frequently because the committee really just wasn't representative of the
From the caucus body. From the caucus, it would be sent back to committee during.
Yeah, no. Sometimes it would either no. Once it was at the caucus, it would generally get onto the floor, whether it was whether all were in agreement or not, and then it was consent or non-consent. But anyway, we're getting into county lawmaking. But it was the same idea that the committee's vote did not represent what the entire body was planning to do with it or how the debate would go.
And also, it seems to me that committee members can sometimes believe that a bill should make it out of committee, or an ordinance or a local law should make it out of committee, and that there should be a full vote on it. Right. And so they might be voting it positively out of committee for different reasons, right, than evaluating whether in the final vote they will support it or be against it.
Yeah,
is that fair to say?
I've seen that quite often, where folks just want to make sure it gets to the full council for everybody to be able to vote, so they'll pass it through, make a motion or a second so that it gets through. So I've seen that quite a bit in years.
In some cases, I've seen too where something moves out of committee to caucus, and not always are the other alder persons who were not at committee know even what happened. I've seen that where they weren't aware that actually there was conflict in the vote, and when they find that out, they become curious about why were their other colleagues not in favor, of the local law language. I've seen that happen before. So there seems to be sometimes not really clear in the past, a real clear understanding of what happens in the committee work. It's just they're looking on the page to see, oh, this is in front of us today. Do you notice that?
I do, and actually, when I took office for my current role, I noticed that quite a bit in my 2 years representing Ward 9. So one of the things that I started was a council newsletter that I would write monthly, and the main focus was to make sure that the council got all the information from all the committees, because most council members serve on 2 out of the 4 committees. There's 2 aldermen that serve on 3 of them. So if you are on finance and audit and not laws and rules, you could still go to the laws and rules meeting and take place, but most of the time the council member doesn't, and so they miss a lot of the discussion. So that's something that I did start back in January, and I think it's making a difference.
Yeah, for sure. That's great.
Well, I wanted to add too that that's why caucus is really important, because that's your opportunity to come together with your other fellow party members and hopefully talk through some of these issues, and to have a debate with them and to figure out, what the internal debates were in committee, where they stand, why they stand there, and to ask them questions and to play devil's advocate before you can come to a conclusion. Although, I mean, that's the ideal I'm surprised Andrea and Jenny aren't laughing at me, because that often doesn't happen in caucus, and there are divisions and all that kind of stuff. But ideally, that's what ought to happen in caucus, and why it's so important to interact with your colleagues at that moment. Because, you know, legislative bodies, committees do the work of legislative bodies. You can't have a legislator address all of the different issues that a legislator would have to address in order to be fully informed. Everybody's got a kind of a particular duty to perform. You go perform it to the best of your ability. You come back to caucus, you relay, and hopefully that kind of collegial information from other caucus or from other committee meetings is coming back to you, so that you can sit around together and figure out where you stand. But you know, unfortunately, sometimes that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I always found the caucus to be the most interesting meeting of the month. I only wish it was able to be a little longer, because at least in Ulster County, it's a little different than the city. We had our caucus on the same night. So it was more like a huddle than a very deliberative, and I mean, it was deliberative, and it was probably, as I said, the most strategic of all the meetings. But I felt as if it should happen more often. That's sort of,
yeah. During my term, it happened at least twice a month, sometimes more. And, you know, it was always a joke, because the Democratic caucus would be there until like 3 a.m, and the Republicans would caucus for like 10 minutes and leave. And I'm exaggerating a bit to make a point, but I think everyone would agree, even the Republicans would agree, that their caucus meetings were far shorter than ours.
well, you know, the old adage, you know, the Democrats want to fall in love and the Republicans want to fall in line. So that's what happened in when I was in the legislature too. They, you know, they were quick.
Well,
I would just say too, at the city level, and Andrea, you can speak to this, what's really weird is everyone's a Democrat. Like the only caucus in town is the Democratic caucus. And yet there are often deep divisions among Democrats in the caucus internally. There are different kinds of Democrats, and you can see, you know, sort of on the national level, maybe more blue dog Democrats, we might call them, more progressive Democrats, and sometimes they might be of the same party, but they have very, very different views.
No.
Would you agree?
No, I mean, I would just, I mean, Lynn said it all. I mean, it's an odd caucus, just because we're the only caucus, and we're, out of 10 of us, 9 of us are Democrats, and the other is a non-enrolled who aligns with Democrats. So
do you generally vote?
very different experience.
So do you generally all vote? I mean, I haven't been following recently, but just for our public, do you generally all vote the same way, or is there some dissent?
I'm seeing more dissent this year, although I think last night's meeting, everything passed 9-0. But overall this year, I'm seeing more dissent than I did my 2 years as a voting member.
And, you know, without necessarily, you know, getting into the weeds, I was just wondering, is there a general pattern to that? You know, does it have to do with defending certain ideas, let's say?
You know, that's a really good question, but I haven't put enough thought into it to, I think, have an eloquent answer. But I'm sure there is some kind of pattern. I would probably want to ponder on that a little bit before I spit something out.
What do you mean?
You said that there was some dissent.
What do you mean by, that's an interesting question, but I'm not following it. So do you
So,
mean?
for example, you know, if there are folks who, I don't know what the dissent would be about and where you're seeing it, but if there are people, for example, who might fall on one side or the other, for example, of this current local law, is there disagreement about that one?
There was some debate, but it did pass through 9-0 yesterday. So, I mean, most of this council, I think their priority is to help people. So I think looking at this local law, they felt that this could help people. And therefore the consequences of it, which were debated, were determined not to be as relevant as maybe this step helping a few folks in our city. And I think that's what the pattern I see with the council is they'll typically go to what they feel like is helping their constituents, which is what elected officials should be doing, is just sometimes have different opinions on what is helping, you know, from your neighbor or your colleague.
Right, it depends on who has your ear, probably. Right. In most cases, I mean, and that's not a, you know, it's not meant to be sarcastic at all. It's really, I think, true. But I do think that that's why I really appreciate these democratic processes. I don't know, maybe there's a better way of putting it, but I want to just keep moving through the local law process and circling back to where did we leave off? We left off with the committee work is complete, and we could even, there's almost like more granular discussion about that, but let's be broad for now. So the committee work is done, and the local law moves out of committee, whether it's, you know, as a recommendation to be sent to the floor. So the next step for the local law is to be on the agenda for caucus. So can you just speak a little briefly about what is caucus again in relation to what is the Common Council meeting?
Sure. I mean, my experience though with caucus is very different, as Lynn mentioned, just because we're all Democrats, and in my first term it was the same thing. It was the same lineup of 9 Democrats and 1 non-enrolled. So typically what you're doing is going through what you're going to be voting on, so what passed through committee and what is moving on to the floor. In our case, it's the following evening, and talking about, you know, asking last minute questions. The committee members and the chair of the committee, you know, go over everything that was discussed in the meetings to get the non-committee members up to speed. Ask any last minute questions. I mean, there have been plenty of times where we're calling department heads at caucus because a non-committee member thought of a question that wasn't debated. So, you know, it's really good to just have extra ears and eyes on it.
Can the legislation?
What was that?
Can the legislation in caucus be returned to committee in the case that if you call a department head and they get information they hadn't contemplated? Have you seen that occur where it's like, oh no, we're not ready to do this, and it's sent back to committee for more work before?
We do that on the floor of the council meeting. So if in caucus we were to determine that there was still some answers unanswered, or we didn't have the votes that we wanted to pass it through and we still want to, you know, tweak the law, it would move still to the floor, and then an alderman would make a motion to send it back to committee, which would have to have a second, and then it would have to have the majority vote.
And so let's just say it passes through council. What happens next? And wait a second. Can the public speak? I mean, there's public comment at every common council meeting, but like committee, there isn't public comment for caucus, right? That's
correct.
So the first time the public could speak to this, technically, would be at the common council meeting, even though you're not debating it. It's not a public hearing for the legislation, but that would be the first time that you would hear from the public at the very first council meeting when the local law is read. Is that what it is? It's just read the first time?
Yeah, the first council meeting after the committee, after caucus, is the first reading. There's no action taken. But yeah, the public can come and give comment at our council meeting during the public speaking, which happens in the beginning. So they could discuss it. they're not debating with the council, they're just talking to the council.
Have you ever seen the public influence the council in the midst of its local law process? So it's on the floor, it has its first reading, but a dozen community members show up to say, no, this isn't good language, and that, but there's no decision to be made that evening.
Right.
So what happened?
I have seen the public sway some council members before. I mean, specifically on a local law process, there might have been one case where, citizens definitely took a big role in having the voices heard. And it was one of the cases where it passed through committee 5-0. And then when it reached the floor of the council, was sent back because it didn't have the votes. And there's 9 voting members, so typically if you have a coming out of committee 5-0, you feel pretty good about it passing. But this one actually ended up, I think it ended up being a 2-7 vote or 7-2 vote back to committee, and I think the citizens played a huge role in making that happen.
So instead of a first reading, you're saying that if they wanted to send, if the council members, let's call them councilwomen. How about that? Why not? Councilmen, councilwomen. So if they wanted to, they could, at that moment, send it back to, even though it's just the first read, they could send it right back to committee then, or is it?
No, you'd have to wait until the second reading because there's no action taken on the first reading.
So the community shows up and gives public comment. There's the first read. A month later, there's the what? What happens then?
It doesn't go back to committee, but we would readdress it at caucus, and then it would go to council floor for the second reading, and immediately after the second reading is the votes.
Okay, and then
when does the public hearing happen in this process, Andrea?
The public hearing actually doesn't happen until after the council meets or votes, sorry. Although the council can schedule a public hearing within this process that we just outlined. We have the authority that we could do it, but we don't need to do it. The public hearing has to happen by the executive branch after the council passes it.
Okay.
I remember during the Historic Landmarks Preservation Commission ordinance that there was discussion of sending the legislation out of committee to get public comment, and the discussion being that might trigger the local law process. So do you recall that?
I do. I mean, that was within the first few months of me in my seat. So I definitely learned a lot in that process because there's definitely some flaws that were pointed out. Right.
All right. Well, we can keep moving forward because I think we have only a little bit of time left, and it was great.
I just want to say it's really confusing, the difference between these different levels of law. And Jenny pointed this out earlier on and kind of stepped through them. But you start off at the lowest level, resolution, then an ordinance, and then the local law. So the local law is like the highest kind of most respected form of law. And that's because an ordinance delegates power from the state legislature, but a local law, the source of local law power is the state constitution and home rule. So there are different levels of power. Can anyone confirm? I think we need a lawyer. Andrea, we're going to have to send you to law school.
All right, already.
Come back.
That's great.
I don't know.
And the resolution is the local, right? It's
purely local, right? Then the ordinance is like the next step, and I think you're getting power from the state legislature. I'm not sure about that.
You are correct.
Ground.
You are correct, Lynn, yeah.
And then the local law is really important because it's like the state constitution is saying you can do it. The local community can pass the law. The local government can pass the
So a resolution is generally something that you're dealing with an order of business that, first of all, it can be reversed. It's often more temporary. It depends on how the local government wants to handle its more of its sort of, I don't want to say day-to-day, but sort of procedural affairs. Whereas a local law requires that essentially you're not preempting state law, but you're maybe making a law that is addressed by state law, but you want to make it even more restrictive. So you have the power to do that, but it's more of a police power. You're talking about public safety, health, welfare, the ability of the city to take on things that have to do with its how it manages that degree, something of that degree of importance.
And the power of that local community to do it comes from the state constitution. It comes from the very concept of home rule.
Yes.
Whereas an ordinance, the power to deal with the local matter, that ordinance, the power to deal with it comes from the state legislature. So like when ultimately we're sort of ranking powers, if a power is rooted in the state constitution, the constitution comes in at a higher level. If that's the source of the power, then the state legislature is saying, hey, you guys deal with this and we're delegating you the power to do it. Is this fair ground here, or am I in uncharted territory and telling something that's not true?
Well, I mean, an ordinance ordinance and resolution, they also have, in a sense, the force of law. Well, resolution less so. An ordinance is something that is actually in the code. So, but it's dealt with at a local level. It's dealt with in a municipal court. But when you're talking about something that is a local law, this is something that is much more about a level of business that's about the affairs of government, and this is something that is empowered by state law. Does that make sense? We'll have to come back to
yes,
this.
it does. I was just thinking too. I was wondering about if there is a difference between a resolution then and a memorializing resolution.
Oh yeah.
Right. And I think that's why this is. But we'll stay away from that. Given no, but this is such good context. That's true. It's helpful to just continue to bring it forward so that there's context. Even doesn't have to just be at the top. It's good throughout because it can be difficult to understand the difference between how the council is doing its lawmaking.
Difficult for the council to understand sometimes. So I mean, for the public to understand this, when I don't think government does a very good job of educating the public, how then do you fault the public for being ignorant? Because if the government bodies don't educate or communicate, then how are we to blame anybody?
Yeah, I think the goal is we've said this before, I don't know where it came from, and it was Jenny or Lynn, about developing sophistication in civics, and that word might even be a little too hoity. Just, I mean, it is part of, I think, the infrastructure of government, but I do.
And it's hard too, because you have class. It not only is it confusing and complicated, right? Like, which level of law do you trigger and invoke and try to use to change? And then there are different parliamentary procedures to address each law, let alone like at the Common Council. It was really, I can't imagine beginning to write my own legislation at the Common Council level. At least at the legislative level, you had the Ulster County Legislature, you had clerks who could really, who had written legislation, and you had access to your own legislative lawyer in your own Democratic caucus that could help you craft legislation in the way you want it. Like my experience on the Common Council was you're pretty much on your own, or you got to reach out to Corp Council, and Corp Council is employed by the mayor. So if you want to write a piece of legislation that goes against the mayor's policy prescriptions, you're going to run into a little bit of trouble. You're kind of out there on your own. And in addition to that, you know, there've been, you know, rife throughout history stories about legislators who had mastered parliamentary tactics to get what they want, right? So they're making these parliamentary process maneuvers in order to get the outcome that they want, rather than arguing on the basis of the content of policy and persuading people that it's the right policy. So there's a lot at stake in these different procedures, and they're hard.
You know what I keep hearing too of community members, just, and I think this is so important that I've heard people say, I don't understand it. It's not a language. I mean, it's not, you know, we all have a different way of understanding information. And it would be really interesting and helpful, I think, if there was an emphasis on council. And I know that the council work is so intense. There's so many meetings and what have you, but I never understand why there isn't a real emphasis also, since the constituents in the ward elect you in, that there isn't a regular monthly meeting with the constituents, because it would be really good to talk about these processes and say, what don't you understand? How could we improve? How could this language improve so that it's more accessible? So that we're not just saying all or nothing. The government either educates the public or we get nothing at all. And I mean, this isn't a solution. And so,
but if we do have, sorry, I'm just jumping in here, but you know, one of the things that, especially in my role as president, that I spend a lot of time researching the law, because we don't have a lawyer. And I have to do, you know, a lawyer, somebody with a law degree would look at it and quickly understand it. I, you know, take 30 minutes reading one paragraph, and then I'm like, I think I got it now. We also don't have our own clerk. So, you know, if we didn't have to be doing that work, that if we had our own counsel and if we had our own clerk, then we would have more time to do constituent outreach.
mm-hmm. That's
so
right.
Another reason.
And I think that
I'll just say too, like in my experience, a lot of times it was hard to get people to come out. They're working and they're trying to pay the bills, and they have kids at home or other responsibilities, and it's a lot to ask them to you know, master this other language and know the process. So I don't know, it's a real push and pull. And I wonder, this leads me to a question, and I'll just ask it, and you can respond to it in the way that you see fit. But it makes me wonder if we're really going to have separation of powers, whether common council members, whether being an alderman or an alderwoman should be a full-time job, because it really kind of is, and yet we give it this part-time status.
Yeah, I mean, right now, especially because of the pandemic, most of my music is not happening. So I'm essentially unemployed with my main job. So I'm putting in easily 40 hours of work on council work. And even before, when I did have a full-time job of music making, I was probably putting in close to that. And I know the rest of the council members, they're putting in at least a part-time job for this and not getting paid a part-time salary. So, you know, none of us do this for the money, obviously. It's, you know, we feel like this is our duty, and that's why we do it. But we put in a lot of time. And so that could be another thing is, you know, if it's more of a full-time job for the council president or part-time for the council members, would they have their more time to get the work done too, and more outreach?
But we also just exposed a couple of gaps again. I mean, I should have been keeping track of the gaps, but one of them is that you're having to read legal documents and you're not a lawyer. So what takes you an hour could take a lawyer 2 minutes. And you do have representation, but when we've talked about this before, but the council doesn't have its own representation, which I think is in the public's best interest, period. So the root problem is, it would seem like, is to identify all of the ways that the foundation could be improved, and see if that actually improves the amount of time that you're spending. And from that place, from first fixing the problems, get a better sense of how much time what's the realistic job requirement. Because if we're just adding time on top of a bad, without addressing the problems at the root, we're not improving, I don't think, the efficiency and effectiveness of government. I should say effectiveness. Efficiency is good too, but we want you to be effective. And I hate to cut that off, but actually, Jenny, do you have something also to say about that? Because it was a question for Andrea. I've chimed in. Just in fairness, do you have more to add to that before we kind of round out the local law process?
Oh no, I mean, I was just going to say that we've had this gone back and forth about how, and this is a focus of this program, about how the public is supposed to be engaged when it's already difficult enough even for a legislator, an older person, to be not only engaged, but just to even have that learning curve to understand how the process works. And so I'm not really sure what the answer is. You had suggested last week the idea of a more civilian, like a civil, what do we call it? Like
a peace. Oops.
Civilian corps.
Yeah,
right?
like a Peace Corps. Yeah.
Right, like everybody gets a whack at being an older person.
I love that.
I think if more resources were made available to the Common Council for them to understand the process better, to understand, to be able to vet, because in the county legislature, we had an awesome staff. They were really helpful in not only the drafting, but in just making the process run. And I don't understand how at the city level that's supposed to work, so that you as alder people can represent the public in a way that is balanced in comparison to the executive branch. And we've brought this up a few times in the last month that we've been doing this show, but I really think we do have to re-examine the balance of power and the relationship that the legislative and executive branch have to one another in local government, which is one of the reasons we think that revisiting the charter is so important. Because structurally right now, I think it stretches, and I think it was true at the legislature and the county as well, it stretches the part-time, very, very part-time body to the point that they are potentially not making decisions based on the deepest or fullest amount of knowledge that they could have. Even the resources, for example, to spend time with the public in ward meetings, or do the surveys that they need to do. I think this is really important, and I don't think it's working as well as it could, the way that it's currently set up.
Yeah, and I'll just say, like, there are so many responses you could give back to my question about how that's a silly idea, we couldn't do it. And I just want to recognize that. I mean, certainly if running for office at the legislative level, Ulster County or Common Council, I wouldn't have been able to run if it were full-time. I have a job, and so it might cut down who can participate, and we might not have the budget for it, and there could be 50 other reasons why you could argue that it's a bad idea. But it just seems to me that we're strained.
Yeah, we are strained, but it also concerns, what came to mind immediately was, if it's a full-time job, who's going to want to give that up? You get a full-time salary, you get the best benefits you can get in Ulster County. It could actually become very problematic in terms of it already is problematic where people,
I think at the Ulster County legislative level it is
a big problem, and it keeps people serving way beyond what's actually useful to the public good, to be honest. And that's a whole other topic. We're really running behind. And I appreciate, Andrea, your extra time tonight, but we have to get through this process, and I'm intrigued. So it passes, it passes the council vote. There's a second reading. There's, again, there's public comment. There's always public comment before every meeting. We've determined that there isn't a requirement for a public hearing, but I'm curious about that. I need to go back and see, but whatever. For now, that's what we've determined this evening. It may not be factual, but it probably is, and we will clarify if we need to. So it goes through, it's been voted upon. Now what? What happens next?
It goes to the executive's desk for him to schedule a public hearing within 10 days. That when that public hearing happens, then he could sign it into law or he could veto it. So he has two options. If he signs it, then it is the law of the land, or the law of the City of Kingston. And if he vetoes it, the council can overturn a veto. I think the time period is within 30 days.
But wait a second, he doesn't have to sign the law that evening, or she. They don't have to. They have 10 days after the public hearing to make a decision.
Oh yeah, it doesn't have to happen right then. I mean, I've seen it where they have signed it in that night, but no, I think they do have 10 days, right?
And a veto is a right. In a way, it's great for everybody to know that the power in the city is in their legislative body.
Yeah, and ends with the council.
Right, which is so powerful. You mentioned something about a 7-day window for the council in the local law process earlier, or did I misunderstand that?
No, there is a waiting period. Once the law is put on the desk of the council, it is a 7-day waiting period for an action to happen. But having it be 2 months, and we take action after the second reading, you have that 7-day window.
I see. 7-day window to what? Change your mind? Before it goes to the mayor? Sorry, just for clarification.
No.
Yes. I'm sorry, Andrea.
Did you say go to the mayor?
I'm not quite following where that 7-day falls in the process.
It's during the legislative process. It's not the 10-day window is the mayor's window.
Right.
Or the public hearing, and then his window of time, or her window of time of signing it into law.
So the mayor would have 10 days to schedule a public hearing, right? So a public hearing is set. The public speaks to the mayor, sways his or her opinion or not. The mayor that evening can sign it into law. They can veto it, or they can wait a day or two and make a decision. And they'll have another 10-day window once the public hearing is over to make a decision if they haven't made a decision on that day. Correct?
Yeah.
All right. And the 7 days, it sounds like, I'm not quite sure where that falls, but.
Yeah, honestly, I was trying to get clarification from Corp Counsel about that, because reading through that was one of my questions a few months ago when we were looking at a potential local law. Because I'm reading, I'm sure you've all read the Adopting Local Laws in New York State multiple times. So it's in there that it talks about the 7-day window. And I was aiming to get clarification, and maybe one of you know the clarification. If it's they talk about the 7-day window of the final draft has to be with the legislative body for 7 days. And the way Corp Counsel explained it to me is because you don't vote on it for 2 months, then that 7-day window is kind of built in.
I see. Interesting. Well, we can circle back on that. I think there are two questions. One is the public hearing potential during the council process, and two is what is the 7 days, and it's built in or not. I mean, I think that's sometimes a problem with Corp Council in Kingston, is it's not always something we really do need to we need to check these things, unfortunately. So
I'll just say too, like when you're dealing with a local law, in my experience, and Andrea and Jenny, please jump in. You know, time can either be your ally or your enemy in dealing with these laws, and then trying to mobilize people and get a vote your way. In other words, mobilizing people to come out and say, you know, I don't like this law, right? And there's been support for it on the common council. And the more time you have, and the more people you can mobilize, and the more people who can come out and speak to why they don't like it, the greater the chance you have of someone changing their mind and really rethinking this on the council. Or it can go the other way, right? So sometimes you know, it's the you know, local law, and the process you have to go through is the bane of your existence. Another time it's your ally or your friend. But really the idea behind it is to make sure that the law is well considered, and to give people the opportunity to change their mind. And you can speak to that, both Jenny and Andrea.
You know, we did it a little differently in the legislature, because what we would do is actually put it out for a public hearing before the law would go in for its 2 readings. So I don't know why they did it differently, and again, forgive me for not understanding the city process as well. We had again, it was different timing for that. And very often it would go out for a public hearing, and the process of the county legislature was put it out for a public hearing, at least to see what to sort of test the temperature of the public. And then very frequently it would go back to committee and not come back out for some time. So their procedure was simply different. And I'm not really sure.
my understanding, though, and I want to go back and look, is that sending it out for a public hearing, if this is part of the process, starts the local law process.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there was the argument that, oh, let's get the temperature of the public, but I don't think that that's the way this works. So let's look and not speculate that. But Lynn, I think that time is in the public's best interest. I mean, that's the whole idea, for me anyhow, and why process is so important, is that it gives us time to be reflective. It gives us time to participate, in order to make sure that things are done in a way that are, I mean, there's so many things to consider all the time when something's in front of you. There are plans that exist. There are, you know, process systems, laws, processes, etc. I appreciate time. I wonder, you know, when you say time can be your friend or your enemy, are you referring to that in terms of someone who is in elected office? Or do you mean that in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are laws that 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 clearly have a broad public effect, and there's a clear public interest in passing those laws. But sometimes legislatures deal with laws that affect a narrow subgroup, and that narrow subgroup is really intensely interested in the law, and the public is generally apathetic. And you might, as a legislator, think that they ought not to be apathetic about that law, that some particular interest group is really very interested in it. If it's passed, it's going to disproportionately benefit them. But the public is quiescent about it. Then it's not so clear cut, right? Then it's because you're trying to activate the public, and more time to activate the public may help, or it may be fruitless. So because they may just remain apathetic. So the dynamics of your constituency the nature of the law, who it impacts, who's going to be disproportionately interested. All of that can have an effect on a legislator who's trying to determine within a time frame how they're going to vote on a law.
Right.
And so time is not always your best friend, particularly when you're dealing with a law that's going to benefit a couple of really intensely interested, well-organized individuals with resources on an issue that the public, has better things to do. And I can think a lot of those issues that, I think about a lot of the decisions that are made at the county level with the IDA, for example, right? Those sorts of decisions, you get some really powerful, well-resourced individuals or groups and a more generally ignorant or apathetic public. And, bad stuff can happen.
That is I'm glad that you cited an example, because it's an excellent example that helps us to understand that better there are differences. I mean, there are organized groups that do really good work, but I think you're right when you talk about resources and what groups have resources and what groups don't, and where those resources coming from is so important and not always easy to track. We're rounding up the program now, and I want to thank you, Andrea, for your time. And we'll list these resources and can also circle back with any, outstanding or to fill in some of the questions that came up that we might not have were able to answer tonight. Not many, but I also want to just clarify, I made a comment about our court counsel, and I want to say that in my experience that I felt it's important to double check quite often the work, and I would really in the future appreciate having legislative and executive counsel so that there's a second set of eyes to limit that workload on just average community members like myself. I struggle with the same thing you described, Andrea, and that it's difficult in that way. And I think to finish up, as council president now, with the ability to help not only the council members understand what's in front of them and the process steps that they need to take or options in other ways. I've watched you over the last few months. I've noticed that the council seems to be running better than I've ever seen it. Honestly, in more than a decade of watching, and I attribute that in part to your leadership or stewardship, I should say, of the council, and appreciate that. Maybe you have some closing words about what your thoughts are and intentions are to also work towards ways for the public to better engage with the council work going forward.
Well, thank you for that. One thing that I've been really focusing on is just passing knowledge, not necessarily to say that I have all the knowledge. I was a freshman legislator who got the nomination to run for council president. So, I only served one term. There's still a lot that I'm learning. But everything that I do, I try and share with the council. So everything that I learn, I try and pass along to the council so that we're all on the same path and get them as much information as possible. So that's just, I think, if you're seeing a difference, and if I maybe have a little bit of the credit of that is just making sure everybody has on their desk the information and tools that they need. And I think a good step would be to try and get the public also, in a different way. They may not need to know all the details of everything that we do, but, try and figure out a toolbox to make that happen too. I just always encourage anybody from the public to reach out to me or to their alderman with comments, or if there's something that they don't understand, why something is happening. There's so many layers, and both Lynn and Jenny understand, what you see on the surface, and Rebecca, from all your work on on an other side, there's so many different layers that the public doesn't see, and all you have to do is ask, and hopefully your alderman or me will explain it to you. So it's just about obtaining knowledge.
It's a pretty messy sausage.
I would like sausage. And, you know, so Andrea, thank you and all the council women for their hard work.
Yeah, you know, I just wanted to say,
I don't get it. Why don't we just start? Let's see if that catches on.
I just want to say, Andrea, I think you've done a really wonderful job. And, you know, being the head of the council is a little bit like riding a tiger. And you've done it with great grace. And I think you've done a terrific job with some really, you know, volatile issues. So I just want to thank you and, you know, say that I'm enormously proud of you. So thanks so much for your service.
I appreciate that.
Thank you.
And thanks for having me. It's great seeing everybody.
Thank you. And co-host, stay on the line for a minute, would you? And Andrea, we'll see you at the next Zoom meeting, the next Zoom council meeting, right? We're still remote for a while.
Yes. Yeah. All right. So I'm leaving. So everybody have a nice night, and thanks.
Go have a drink.
Going into executive session now.
A glass of wine awaits me.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
That's great. We should close up. That was a long one, but I feel like, you know, that's some important stuff. So much was said.
Well, I have to say that publication by the state, every time I look at it, just like what she said, somebody needs to revise it a little bit because it's not the easiest thing to follow. And for those who haven't had a chance to look at it, it's called Adopting Local Laws in New York State. It gets into the very nitty-gritty of the procedure, but it's not very clear about when the public hearing is supposed to be held. And it's not very clear about the role of the council in calling one. So,
well, I wanted to say as well, like some of these issues, you know, there are limits to the precision of language, and some of these rules require interpretation. And you can go to precedent, and there's disagreement within precedent, and then you can go to different lawyers, and different lawyers will give you different interpretations. So I think it's really important to have a lawyer who is representing you or representing your caucus or the legislative branch. Because there is room for differing interpretations depending on your perspective and where you stand. And I'll just say too, there was no comparison to having staff at the Ulster County Legislature to having no staff, you know, or having a clerk on the Common Council. I mean, the staff in the clerk's office at the legislature were just amazing. Yes. If you wanted to invite someone to a meeting and you were chairing the meeting, you know, you had a full-time job, and their job was to contact that person, to set up when they would come, to let them know some of the questions that might be asked, what materials they should bring. All of that stuff seems silly, but when you have multiple meetings and you're trying to study with some complexity the issues that are coming before you, to have that kind of staff help is just unbeatable and just really an advantage. It helps you do your job.
I think that's why the charter is so important.
Yes.
The charter has gone and set us up. You know, we have the city manager charter, and it doesn't. And so the public has gotten used to this idea that why does the council need a lawyer? Why do they need a clerk? Or why does the mayor need a deputy? Like, we should really think through what staff is required. It's not, you can't compare these jobs to typical jobs. These are really critical jobs that are defining the shape of our lives and our communities, like, you know,
yes,
progress. And so we have this charter that was never intended to support a strong mayor form of government, and here we are.
Also, you know, when we were looking at charters all around New York State, Jerry Benjamin and I when you look at Suffolk County, it has 200,000 constituents for each county legislator. And in Westchester, I think it's 48,000. In Ulster County, it's 8,100 people per legislator. So we're talking about a very, very broad array of different choices that could be made in order to structure the way we do things differently. It allowed for them to have full-time jobs in Suffolk County, many more resources in Westchester. Of course, these are wealthier places, but when you start looking at the number of people who are represented here, this is the kind of decision that would have to be made around the decennial census. So we've kind of just missed an opportunity. But these changes can be made over time. The idea of maybe having a little bit more heft to the job, maybe fewer. We used to have 11. Did we not have 11 alder
We had 11 wards in
yeah, 11 wards.
But we might have had more at one point. I don't know. I at one time heard 14, but I don't know. Certainly
one of the rules of thumb is that the more parochial system is, the fewer people you represent, because there's a lot of and when I say parochial, I mean essentially the idea of politics being extraordinarily local to the point, and it often happens in rural areas. But in this day and age, with the amount of communication technology that we have, the idea of having 8,100 people represented, now we still have one of the largest legislatures in New York State, and we still have one of the larger common councils for our population. So these are all things that should be explored as we revisit the charter and think about not only the number of alder people and wards, but also the way that they are supported in the work they do.
Yeah, and I think that's a great place to call it a night. There's so much to talk about, and I want to thank you both for joining me and being a part of this series. What's the Process on KingstonCitizens.org. My name's Rebecca Martin.
My name's Lynn Eckert.
And I'm Jennifer Schwartz Berky.
And we thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week. Good night.
Good night.